This video is brought to you by Dollar Shave Club. Use the link in the description for a special $5 starter set. Today we're taking a look at the differences between rich people and poor people beyond just money. For example, how does money affect a person's prospects, their diet, or even their estimated lifespan? Join us as we take a closer look. In this episode of the Infographic Show, Rich versus Poor. First, just how big is the gap between rich and poor here in America? The truth might be shocking, as several recent studies have shown that the United States has the largest wealth inequality gap of any first world nation. In fact, current levels of wealth inequality are comparable to 1920s pre-Great Depression America. But how did we get there after the decades of middle-class growth following World War II? One of the biggest factors in recreating the Great American Wealth Gap has been globalization. With major industries destroyed around the world following World War II, the US became a manufacturing powerhouse, leading to the creation of millions of well-paying, blue-collar jobs. Yet as access to markets overseas expanded and the cost of transporting goods plummeted, companies began a mass exodus to cheap labor markets around the world, most notably Mexico, India, Indonesia, and China. Rather than pay the fair wages that took decades of hard work by labor unions and politicians to enforce, companies instead relocated their manufacturing base overseas and then lobbied those governments to prevent the creation of the same wage protection legislation we have here in the US. Even today, we are seeing a new shift, with some companies already pulling out of India and China as their workers too fall victim to globalization after their governments began to enforce, or threatened to enforce, minimum wage and workers' compensation laws. The second major factor in the collapse of the American middle class was automation. First hitting the automobile industry in the mid-60s, more and more advanced robotics are starting to edge Americans out of the few manufacturing jobs that still remain in the US. That effect is now spreading to jobs once thought safe from replacement by robots, with companies like McDonald's field testing self-service ordering kiosks with the eventual goal of replacing all staff, from the cashier to the cook. This slow takeover should be clearly visible even to you in your own life. Next time you go to the grocery store, notice the self-checkout lane and the self-service movie rental kiosk. Those two machines alone represent 3 shifts or 9 total workers replaced for a 24-hour business. So just how big is the difference between rich and poor now? Well, for starters, the rich are richer than ever. In 1982, the lowest ranked member of Forbes' annual list of America's richest 400 had a net worth of $80 million, while the average member on the list had a net worth of $280 million. In 2016, the poorest member of Forbes' richest 400 Americans needed a net worth of $1.7 billion just to enter the list, with the average member holding a net worth of $6 billion. After adjusting for inflation, that's over 10 times the 1982 average. But inequality is skyrocketing even between the richest Americans, with the richest American having a value of $2 billion in 1982 versus $81 billion in 2016, outpacing gains at either the entry point to Forbes' richest 400 or the average. For the rest of us, our net worth has actually dropped, with only those making over $200,000 actually holding or increasing their net worth since 2000. The difference between rich and poor is also from where the rich and poor actually get their wealth from. For the top 1%, over 49% of their wealth is derived from highly lucrative sources such as stocks and mutual funds, making it easier to continue to grow that wealth and reinvest it. For America's bottom 90%, only 9.1% of their wealth comes from these sources, instead coming overwhelmingly from the value of their homes and real estate, sources not nearly as lucrative and thus harder to reinvest with in order to grow wealth, and also the biggest hit asset category by the recent Great Recession. The amount of debt held by the top 1% versus the bottom 90% is even more skewed, with the top 1% only holding 5.4% of all public debt, and the bottom 90% holding 73.5% of debt, yet another factor that makes it difficult for the bottom 90% to try to increase their wealth. The wealth gap is also affecting us at the dinner table, with a marked difference in the diets between rich and poor. While overall American health and eating habits has improved in the last 25 years, the majority of these gains have been in higher income households. Some of the factors thought to be the source of this disparity include better health education amongst wealthier Americans and the rising cost of fruits, vegetables, and nuts versus the low cost of prepackaged meals high in saturated fats, sugar, and sodium. Work and quality of life also affect this trend, with richer Americans working better jobs that provide greater amounts of personal satisfaction, and poorer Americans having higher levels of stress and job dissatisfaction, or being forced to work multiple jobs to make full-time hours, leading to a preference for quick, easy to make, prepackaged meals. Smaller choices have also driven the disparity, with higher income Americans eating more fruits and replacing sugary fruit juices with whole fruits. Wealthier Americans are also dropping processed grains with added sugar and sodium for whole grains and wheat breads, and ditching sugary snacks for things like natural peanut butter and nuts. Not surprisingly though, neither wealthy nor poor Americans have increased their intake of vegetables because vegetables are terrible. Things like income disparity, differences in total debt, and even diet may be expected as differences between rich and poor people. But what about total life expectancy? What about a life expectancy difference of 21 years even here in America? A University of Washington study looking at the differences in American life expectancies between 1980 and 2014 discovered a shocking 21-year disparity between the most affluent counties in the US and the poorest. Researchers discovered that residents of certain affluent counties in Colorado had the highest expectancies at 87 years, while people in several counties of North and South Dakota had a life expectancy of only 66 years. If this is shocking to you, don't worry. It was for the researchers involved as well, with one commenting that they expected to see such a drastic difference between the US and a third world nation, not between different counties here in America. Yet the disparity is only expected to grow, with the data showing that mortality trends for individuals aged 25 to 45 years in poorer US counties experienced an increase of 11.5% since 1980 and shows no sign of slowing down. And while overall life expectancy has increased by 5 years here in the US, we are actually at the bottom of life expectancy of nearly any first world nation, despite spending more on healthcare than the rest of the world, just barely beating Romania, Serbia, and Macedonia. Once the US was a beacon to the world with a robust middle class that provided opportunity to all. Today, the reality is far different. In the last 30 years, we have reversed every gain achieved by the great post-World War II middle class boom and reverted back to pre-Great Depression levels of wealth disparity and income inequality. Yet the cost of living continues to rise, while access to healthcare and education shrinks and automation replaces the American blue-collar worker. Where this future will lead us is uncertain, but what is certain is that without some major changes, the great American dream will at last truly be dead to the majority of American citizens. But whether you're rich or poor, a great way to make your mornings better is by using Dollar Shave Club. We all have our everyday grooming routines. Brush your teeth, wash your face, make your hair look like you didn't just fall out of an airplane. Well, we bet you didn't know that Dollar Shave Club, yes, that Dollar Shave Club, has all the grooming products you could possibly need. They're giving away their Daily Essentials starter set to fans of the infographic show for only $5. This starter set features 3 trial-size versions of their most popular products that will help you stay fresh and clean. In your first box, you'll receive their shave butter, body wash, and One Wipe Charlie's butt wipes. You'll also receive their executive razor, which includes their premium weighty handle and full cassette of cartridges. After the first box, replacement cartridges are sent directly to your home for only a few bucks a month. This $5 offer is available at dollarshaveclub.com/infographics or by clicking the link in the description. Get ready to look, feel, and smell your best. So, do you think the gap between the rich and the poor needs to be narrowed? Can you see and feel the difference? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called Ninja vs. You. How do you compare in Fortnite? Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.